In the quiet pre-dawn haze of a town that prides itself on peace, a single flashing blue light cuts through the darkness. It's a scene we've seen before, but this time is different. The man being pulled over isn't just any citizen. The officer approaching the car isn't just any cop. And the reason for the stop looking suspicious is about to unravel a web of secrets and lies that will shake the very foundation of the Northwood Police Department. What happens when the man in the car holds the keys to the officer's future? Stay with us for a story of power, prejudice, and karma served ice cold. The digital clock on the dashboard of the sleek black Genesis G90 glowed 4:58 a.m. Outside the world was a canvas of deep indigos and soft greys, the last vestiges of night clinging stubbornly to the manicured lawns of Northwood, a suburb that sold itself as a postcard of American tranquility for Dr. Marcus Thorne. This was the quietest part of the day, a sacred time for reflection before the town and his new immense responsibilities awoke. He'd spent the last 25 years climbing. From a rookie walking the beat in the concrete jungle of Chicago's South Side, picking up a law degree and a doctorate in criminology along the way, to a deputy chief in Atlanta, he had seen the absolute worst and the surprising best of humanity. Now at 52, he was here in this meticulously planned community, hand-picked by a town council desperate to reform a police department haunted by whispers of racial bias and old-school cronyism. He was Northwood's new chief of police, a fact known only to a select few. His official start was a week away, but Marcus was a man who believed in reconnaissance. To understand the battlefield, you had to walk the ground. His drive was a methodical grid search of his new domain. He noted the slumbering parks, the pristine school buildings, the cul-de-sacs where million-dollar homes stood as silent monuments to success. He was observing, learning the town's rhythms, its scent, its soul. He wore a simple grey hoodie over a plain t-shirt and dark jeans, the antithesis of a uniform. He needed to see this place not as a chief, but as a resident, as a black man. That's when the world behind him exploded in a strobing torrent of red and blue. Marcus's heart didn't jump. It sank. It was a heavy, familiar feeling, a ghost from his past he thought he had outrun. He glanced in the rearview mirror. A Northwood Police Department cruiser, stark white with bold blue lettering, was plastered to his bumpers, its lights painting the interior of his luxury sedan in frantic alternating hues. Well now, he murmured to the empty car. The welcoming committee. He followed the protocol he'd taught his own son, the same one he'd followed countless times himself, before his career had shielded him. He signaled, pulled the Genesis over to the curb under the pale, anemic glow of a streetlight, and killed the engine. He turned on the interior dome light, placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, and waited. Seconds stretched into a minute. This was a tactic. Let the driver sweat. Let the uncertainty build. Marcus had seen it used and had argued against it. It didn't de-escalate. It marinated the situation in fear. Finally, a spotlight from the cruiser bleached his rear-view mirror, blinding him. A figure detached itself from the driver's side. The silhouette was bulky, laden with gear, moving with a swagger that was more warrior than peacekeeper. As the officer approached the passenger side, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered firearm, Marcus got his first good look at him. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a square jaw and a military-style buzz cut. His name tag, glinting in the dome light, read Miller. Officer Miller's face was a mask of stern neutrality, but his eyes narrow and scanning every inch of the car's interior betrayed a different story. They were hungry, searching for justification. Miller's heavy-knuckled fist rapped twice on the passenger window. Marcus didn't move his hands from the wheel. He lowered the window with the press of a button. "Morning, Officer Marcus," said his voice, calm, measured. Miller didn't return the greeting. He leaned down his head uncomfortably close, his gaze sweeping over Marcus, the empty passenger seat, the clean, uncluttered back. His eyes lingered on Marcus's face. "License and registration," Miller commanded. His tone was flat, devoid of courtesy. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Officer Marcus asked, keeping his hands exactly where they were. It was a simple question, a fundamental right, but in this context, it was an act of defiance. A flicker of annoyance in Miller's eyes. "License and registration. Now." "I'd be happy to provide them," Marcus replied, his voice still even. "But I am entitled to know the reason for the traffic stop. That's not just courtesy, officer. That's procedure." Section 4, Subsection B of the Northwood PD's own conduct manual. The reference, so specific and unexpected, landed like a stone in a quiet pond. Miller's jaw tightened. He clearly wasn't used to being quoted chapter and verse from a manual he'd likely only skimmed. "You fit the description," Miller clipped out the words sharp and dismissive. "The description of whom a suspect in a series of break-ins in this area. Black male, driving a dark-colored sedan." Miller's eyes raked over Marcus's hoodie. Wearing a hoodie. It was the oldest, most tired script in the book. Marcus felt a wave of profound weariness wash over him, so potent it was almost physical. A black man, a dark car, a hoodie, in a wealthy neighborhood, the trifecta of suspicion, a dark-colored sedan. Marcus repeated, gesturing with a slight nod to his own car. "This is a 2025 Genesis G90. There aren't many of them on the road. It's registered to a local address. The break-in suspect was he driving a $60,000 luxury car. I don't know. That's what we're going to find out." Miller snapped, his patience fraying. The swagger was hardening into aggression. "Last time. License. Registration. Get them." Slowly. Marcus held the officer's gaze for a long moment. He could see the precipice. He could escalate this demand. A supervisor refused to comply until his rights were fully acknowledged. He had done it before in his youth, and had the scars, both literal and figurative, to prove it. But tonight was different. Tonight was about reconnaissance, and he was getting a master class. "Of course," Officer Marcus said, finally breaking eye contact. "I'm going to reach into my left hip pocket for my wallet. Then I will open the glove compartment for the vehicle's registration." He narrated his every move, his hands moving with deliberate, almost painful slowness. Miller's hand never left his gun. The tension in the small space was thick enough to taste a metallic tang of adrenaline and distrust. He handed the documents out the window. Miller snatched them. His flashlight beam darted between the driver's license and Marcus's face, comparing, confirming. "Dr. Marcus Thorne." Miller read aloud, a hint of derision in his voice as he noted the doctorate. He lingered on the address, a rental property, in one of Northwood's most exclusive gated communities. Big house for a doctor. The pause was intentional, loaded with insinuation. For a black man. The unspoken words hung in the air, more damning than anything he could have said. "I do all right," Marcus said quietly. Miller took the documents and stepped back from the car, his eyes still locked on Marcus. "Stay right there. Don't even think about moving." He walked back to his cruiser, the very picture of authority. But Marcus saw something else. He saw the insecurity, the need to dominate, the fear that masqueraded as toughness. It was a pathology he'd seen in far too many officers, a cancer that ate away at the core of good policing. As he sat in the silent car, bathed in the flashing lights, Marcus Thorne knew his mission in Northwood had just become infinitely more complicated. It wasn't just about reforming a department, it was about performing an exorcism. And he had a feeling Officer Miller was going to be his first and perhaps most difficult demon. The wait was a calculated display of dominance. 10 minutes bled into 15. Marcus watched Miller in his rearview mirror. The officer wasn't just running his license. He was talking on his radio, then on his phone. He was taking his time, letting the indignity of the situation seep into the fine leather of the Genesis. Each passing second was a small assertion of power. I control your time. I control your freedom. Marcus didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He simply sat his hands back on the wheel, his mind a whirring engine of analysis. He catalogued every detail: Miller's posture, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the slight smirk that touched his lips as he talked to whomever was on the other end of the line. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It had become personal for Miller. Marcus's calm, his quiet refusal to be intimidated, had been a challenge, and Miller was rising to it with the only tools he had: petty tyranny and the color of his authority. Finally, the cruiser door opened again. But this time, a second officer emerged from the passenger side. He was older, with a paunch straining against his uniform and a weary, seen-it-all expression. His name tag read, Kowalski. He ambled over to Miller, and they had a brief, hushed conversation. Kowalski glanced at Marcus's car, then said something that made Miller shake his head dismissively. Kowalski shrugged and leaned against the cruiser, a silent, passive participant. Miller strode back to Marcus's window, his boots crunching on the asphalt with renewed purpose. He slapped the license and registration against the roof of the car. "All right, Dr. Thorne," he said, the title now dripping with sarcasm. "Step out of the vehicle." For what reason? Marcus asked, his voice remaining a placid sea in the storm of Miller's aggression. "I said step out of the vehicle. It's a lawful order. An order has to have a lawful basis, officer. You pulled me over for fitting a vague description. My license is valid. My registration is current. There are no warrants for my arrest. On what grounds are you ordering me out of my car?" This was the line. This was the point of no return. Marcus knew it. Miller knew it. Miller's face, which had been a mask of control, began to crumble. A dark flush crept up his neck. "Grounds. I'll give you grounds. Your story isn't checking out. A guy like you in a car like this in this neighborhood at 5 in the morning. It's suspicious. I have reasonable suspicion that you may be involved in criminal activity. Now get out of the car before I remove you from it." The threat hung in the air, ugly and raw. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw Kowalski push himself off the cruiser, a sign that even his passive partner sensed an escalation. "A guy like me?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping, gaining an edge of steel. "What kind of guy is that, Officer Miller?" The direct question, demanding that Miller voice the prejudice he'd been hiding behind procedure, made him flinch. "You know what I mean," he growled. "Now out," No Marcus said. It was a single word spoken without anger, but with the weight of absolute conviction. "You have no probable cause to search my vehicle, and no legitimate reason to order me out of it. If you want to escalate this, I suggest you call your supervisor. Get a sergeant down here. We can have a conversation about the Fourth Amendment and your department's definition of reasonable suspicion." He was laying a trap, and Miller, blinded by his own fury, walked right into it. "I don't need a damn sergeant to tell me how to do my job." Miller shouted, his voice cracking. He reached for his taser. "Get out of the car now. This is your final warning." But before he could unholster the weapon, Kowalski was there, his hand on Miller's arm. "Billy, calm down," Kowalski said, his voice a low rumble. "Just write the ticket and let him go." "What ticket?" Miller spat, trying to shake off his partner's hand. "He hasn't done anything wrong." "That's the point. It's a bogus stop." "Then let him go." Kowalski insisted, his grip tightening. "Look at the car. Look at the guy. He's not the one. Let it go." But Miller was too far gone. He felt his authority being challenged by Marcus, and now undermined by his own partner. He shoved Kowalski back. "He's hiding something, I know it!" Miller yelled, his eyes wild. He turned back to Marcus. "Fine. You want to play lawyer? Let's see how you like this." He reached for the door handle. And in that moment, Marcus Thorne made a decision. The reconnaissance was over. As Miller's fingers touched the cold chrome of the handle, Marcus's phone, which had been sitting in the center console, began to ring. He had programmed a specific piercing ringtone for this number. He held up a single finger to Miller. "One moment, officer. I think you'll want to hear this." He answered the phone and put it on speaker, the volume turned all the way up. A voice, crisp and authoritative, filled the car and spilled out into the pre-dawn air. "Chief Thorne. This is dispatch. We have a message from Mayor Thompson. He apologizes for the early call, but wanted to confirm your 8 a.m. breakfast meeting at the Gilded Spoon. He said to tell you he's looking forward to officially welcoming you to Northwood." Silence. The world seemed to stop. The flashing lights, the tension, the anger, it all froze. Officer Billy Miller's hand was still on the door handle. His face, which had been a mask of rage, had gone slack, his jaw hanging open. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. His eyes, wide with horror, darted from the phone in Marcus's hand to Marcus's calm, unreadable face. "Chief. Thorne." The two words echoed in the space between them. They were not just words. They were a judgment, a verdict, the sound of a career imploding. Kowalski took a slow step backward, his eyes as wide as saucers. He looked at Marcus, then at his partner, a dawning, terrible understanding on his face. He had been standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who had just tried to illegally detain Taze and forcibly remove the new chief of police from his car. Marcus looked at Miller. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply watched as the officer's entire world collapsed in on itself. The swagger, the aggression, the prejudice, it all evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Chief Miller stammered his voice, a choked whisper. He pulled his hand back from the door as if it had been burned. You're the new chief." Marcus disconnected the call and placed the phone back on the console. He looked at the young officer, and for the first time, he let a sliver of the immense, cold authority he possessed show in his eyes. "My name," he said, his voice low and dangerously quiet, "is Marcus Thorne. I am, as of this moment, the acting chief of the Northwood Police Department. And you, Officer Miller, have just become the single most compelling argument for the reforms I was hired to implement." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush the young man. Now Chief Thorne continued as, "I believe I requested some 15 minutes ago. I'd like to see your supervisor. And you and I are going to have a very, very long talk about Section 4, subsection B, and about the description of a suspect who looks just like your new boss." The arrival of Sergeant Davison was a study in controlled panic. He rolled up without sirens, but the speed at which his vehicle screeched to a halt spoke volumes. Davison was a veteran, a man whose face was a road map of 20 years on the force, and as he stepped out of his car, his eyes took in the scene with an expression of pure, unadulterated dread. He saw Miller pale and trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. He saw Kowalski, who looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole, and he saw the man in the Genesis G90, sitting calmly behind the wheel, radiating an aura of authority, so potent it was almost a physical force. Davison didn't need to be told. He knew. The frantic, garbled call from Kowalski had painted a grim enough picture. Sir Davison said, approaching Marcus's window and practically bowing. His voice was laced with a respect that bordered on terror. "Sergeant Frank Davison. I am so sorry for this monumental screw-up." "It's not a screw-up," Sergeant Marcus corrected him, his voice still low and cutting. "A screw-up is a typo on a report. A screw-up is a missed court date." This he gestured towards Miller, who flinched as if struck as a catastrophic failure of training professionalism and basic human decency. "This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. This is the exact reason I am here." He finally opened his door and stepped out of the car. In the dim morning light, standing to his full height, Marcus Thorne was an imposing figure. The simple hoodie and jeans did nothing to diminish his presence. He wasn't just a man in civilian clothes anymore. He was the commander who had just caught his soldiers sleeping, or worse, committing atrocities on the battlefield. He turned his attention fully to Officer Miller. "Your name is Billy Miller, why—" "Yes, sir." "Chief." Miller stammered, his voice barely audible. He was unable to meet Marcus's eyes, his gaze fixed on a spot on the pavement, somewhere near Marcus's feet. "Look at me when I speak to you," Officer Marcus commanded. The order was quiet, but it cracked like a whip in the still air. Miller's head snapped up, his eyes swimming with panic and regret. Not regret for his actions, Marcus noted, but regret for getting caught. "Tell me, Officer Miller." Marcus began, his tone deceptively conversational. "When you decided to pull me over, what was the primary factor in your decision? Was it the make and model of my $60,000 sedan, which you failed to identify, or was it the color of my skin?" "No, sir. It was the description." Miller's voice trailed off, the lie dying on his lips. He knew how flimsy it sounded, how utterly transparent it was in the face of the man standing before him. The description Marcus repeated, nodding slowly. A black male in a dark car. "Let's talk about that description. Where did it originate, dispatch, sir?" "A call came in earlier, about a suspicious vehicle. A call from whom I don't know, sir." "It was an anonymous tip." An anonymous tip, Marcus mused. So no credible witness, no specific vehicle details other than dark, no license plate, just a ghost story. And based on that, you decided to initiate a high-risk stop-accuse, a citizen of being a criminal, and were about to forcibly remove me from my vehicle without probable cause. Is that an accurate summary of your stellar police work this morning? Every word was a nail in the coffin of Miller's career. Sergeant Davison looked physically ill. Kowalski seemed to be trying to merge with the side of his cruiser. "Now let's talk about your partner," Marcus said, turning his gaze to Kowalski, who visibly shrank. "Officer Kowalski, I heard you. You tried to de-escalate. You told him to let it go." "Why?" Kowalski swallowed hard. "Sir, with all due respect to my partner, it didn't feel right. The stop, it felt thin from the start. And you, sir, you were compliant. Calm. There was no threat. So you recognized that Officer Miller was operating outside the bounds of acceptable procedure. I felt he was letting it get to him, sir. He was escalating when he should have been de-escalating. And what would you have done if I hadn't received that phone call?" Marcus pressed. "When your partner, your brother in blue, decided to unholster his taser and was about to illegally assault a citizen who, for the record, is also your new commanding officer. What was your next move going to be? Officer Kowalski, were you going to physically intervene, or were you just going to stand there and watch? Because one is saving a career, and the other is just covering your own ass." The question hung in the air, a stark indictment of the infamous blue wall of silence. Kowalski had no answer. His silence was a confession in itself. He had tried weakly, but he had not been prepared to truly stop his partner. Marcus turned his back on them and faced Sergeant Davison. "Sergeant, I want both of these officers off the street, effective immediately. I want them on desk duty pending a full internal affairs investigation, which I will be personally supervising." "Yes, sir," Davison said, relief warring with his dread. Desk duty was better than immediate termination. Officer Miller Marcus said, turning back around. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the street. A new day was dawning in more ways than one. "You will hand your sidearm, your taser, and your badge to Sergeant Davison. Right now." The finality of the order was absolute. For a police officer, being stripped of your badge and gun is the ultimate humiliation. It's a symbolic castration. Tears welled in Billy Miller's eyes. His tough guy facade had been completely shattered, leaving behind a scared, privileged young man who had just flown too close to the sun and had his wings melted away. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he unbuckled his duty belt. The sound of the plastic clips and Velcro was unnaturally loud in the quiet morning. He handed his firearm to Davison, then his taser. Finally, with a choked sob, he unclipped his badge from his uniform and placed it in his sergeant's outstretched hand. The small piece of polished metal, the source of all his power and prejudice, looked pitiful and inert. Sir Miller pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please, I have a family, a kid on the way. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Marcus looked at him, his expression hard as granite. "You didn't make a mistake, son," he said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You made a choice. You chose to see a threat where there was none. You chose to abuse your power. You chose to let your prejudice dictate your actions. What you feel right now isn't remorse. It's fear of consequences. There's a difference." He continued, his voice resonating with the authority of a man who had earned his position through merit, not entitlement. "You have a family, so do I. I have a wife who worries every time I leave the house. I have a son I had to teach a special set of rules to, just so he might survive an encounter with an officer exactly like you. You talk about your unborn child. I was worried about whether I would live to see the sunrise right here in the town I was hired to protect." He let that sink in, the raw, ugly truth of it. "The real mistake," Marcus said, looking from Miller to Kowalski, and then to Davison, was made by the Northwood Police Department. It was a mistake to foster a culture where an officer like Miller feels emboldened to behave this way, and an officer like Kowalski feels powerless to stop him. That is the mistake I am here to correct, and the correction starts today." He turned and walked back to his car, every eye on him. He paused with his hand on the door. "Sergeant," he said to Davison, "my first official order as Chief of Police. I want a full audit of Officer Miller's arrest record and traffic stops for the last 2 years. I want to see every complaint filed against him, whether it was investigated or not. I want to know how many other guys like me he's pulled over in the middle of the night. Have it on my desk by noon." "Yes," Chief Davison said, his voice hoarse. Marcus got into his car, the engine purring to life with a quiet rumble that sounded like a contented lion. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, not looking back. He didn't need to. In his rearview mirror, he could see it all: Sergeant Davison talking into his radio, his face grim, Kowalski staring at the ground, a man contemplating his own complicity, and Billy Miller standing alone on the sidewalk in his uniform, stripped of his authority. A powerless, weeping man, watching his future drive away in a sleek black Genesis G90. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, burning away the last of the morning mist. For the first time since arriving in Northwood, Marcus Thorne allowed himself a small, grim smile. The reconnaissance was over. The war had just begun. And he had just won the first decisive battle without ever raising his voice. The karma of the badge, he thought, could be a brutal, beautiful thing. The Northwood Police Department headquarters was a modern brick and glass building that, like the town it served, projected an image of clean, efficient transparency. But as Chief Marcus Thorne walked through the automatic glass doors at 7:30 a.m., he knew that glass could hide as many secrets as brick walls. The air inside was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the day's burgeoning caseload. News, especially bad news, travels at the speed of light in a police department, and the story of the pre-dawn traffic stop had already become the stuff of whispered legend. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The officers and civilian staff, milling in the lobby, stared, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and in a few cases outright hostility. Thorne, still in his hoodie and jeans, ignored them all. His eyes were fixed on the second floor, where the administrative offices and his new office were located. Sergeant Davison met him at the base of the stairs, looking haggard. He had a stack of files in his hand. Chief Davison said, his voice low, "We've started pulling Miller's files. It's extensive." "I expected nothing less," Thorne replied coolly. "Is there a secure conference room we can use? I want to see everything. And I need a detective, the best you have, someone who knows how to dig and isn't afraid of getting their hands dirty. And Sergeant, I want someone who isn't in Miller's social circle." The implication was clear. He wanted someone who wouldn't be tempted to bury evidence to protect a friend. Davison nodded, a flicker of understanding and perhaps respect in his tired eyes. "I know just the person. Detective Isabella Rossi. She's sharp, tenacious, and she's not part of the old guard. Her office is on the 3rd floor. Internal Affairs." "Perfect," Thorne said. "Have her meet us in the main conference room in 5 minutes. Bring the files." The main conference room had a large mahogany table and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the manicured town square. It was a room designed for press conferences and commendation ceremonies, not for autopsies of a disgraced officer's career. Thorne took the seat at the head of the table, the seat reserved for the chief. It was a position he hadn't officially inherited yet, but he was claiming it now. This was his department. The reckoning had begun. Detective Isabella Rossi entered precisely 5 minutes later. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and dark hair pulled back in a severe professional bun. She carried a tablet and wore a look of cautious neutrality. She knew who Thorne was, but her expression betrayed no judgment, only a readiness to work. Detective Rossi Thorne said, gesturing to a seat. "Thank you for coming in. I assume Sergeant Davison has given you the broad strokes." "He has." Chief Rossi replied, her voice crisp. "Officer Miller's traffic stop this morning. I'm to assist in the IA investigation." "You're not assisting," Detective Thorne corrected her. "You're leading." "I am supervising. But this is your case. I need an impartial, thorough, and aggressive investigation into the conduct of Officer William Miller, starting with the stop this morning and going back as far as the evidence takes us. I want to know if this was a one-time lapse in judgment or a pattern of behavior. Do you understand?" A flicker of surprise, then resolve in Rossi's eyes. She had likely expected to be a glorified file clerk for the new chief. Instead, he had just handed her the keys to one of the most significant IA cases in the department's recent history. "Understood, Chief," she said, her professional mask solidifying. "Where do we begin?" "We begin here," Davison said, placing the thick stack of files on the table with a heavy thud. "These are Miller's physical complaint files from the last 2 years, the ones that were officially reported and jacketed." For the next hour, there was only the sound of rustling paper. Thorne, Rossi, and Davison combed through the files, and a disturbing picture began to emerge. There were 12 official complaints against Miller. 6 for excessive force during arrests, 4 for verbal abuse, and 2 for what was euphemistically termed racially insensitive language. 12 complaints in 2 years, Rossi murmured, looking up from a particularly nasty report. For a patrol officer in a town like Northwood, that's a 5-alarm fire. Most cops don't get 12 complaints in their entire career. And the disposition of these cases, Thorne asked already, knowing the answer. Davison sighed, flipping to the last page of each file. Every single one was dismissed. Unfounded, exonerated or not sustained. Not a single one resulted in any disciplinary action beyond a verbal counseling session with his then sergeant. "Who was his sergeant?" Thorne asked. Sergeant Henderson Davison replied. "He retired last year. He was Miller's father-in-law." The piece of information dropped into the room like a grenade. Nepotism. Cronyism. The rot was deeper than he had imagined. Miller wasn't just a bad cop. He was a protected one. So the system designed to police the police was compromised from the start. Thorne stated, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It appears so, sir," Rossi said. She tapped her tablet. "But the paper files are only half the story. The real ghosts are in the machine. I'm going to need access to the dash cam and body cam servers. I want to see the video for every one of these complaints. And I want to cross-reference his traffic stop data with the city's demographic information. I want to see who he was stopping, where he was stopping them, and what the outcomes were." "You have my full authorization," Thorne said. "Use whatever resources you need. This investigation is now priority 1 for this department." Rossi nodded and immediately went to work. Her fingers flying across the screen of her tablet, her focus absolute. While she dug into the digital archives, Thorne and Davison continued to sift through the paper files, looking for connections, for patterns. It was Davison who found it. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, his voice strained. He slid a file across the table. The complaint was from 8 months prior. It was filed by a young man named Jamal Peters. The narrative was chillingly familiar. Pulled over late at night in a wealthy neighborhood. Vague description of a suspect. Harassed, verbally abused, and ultimately arrested on a trumped-up resisting arrest charge when he protested the illegal search of his vehicle. The arresting officer was Billy Miller. But it was the addendum to the report that made Thorne's blood run cold. The resisting charge was eventually dropped by the DA's office for lack of evidence, Davison explained. But according to this, Mr. Peters's car was impounded. He couldn't afford the fees. He lost the car. And because he lost the car, he lost his job as a delivery driver. Last known address was a homeless shelter in the next county over. Thorne stared at the file. This wasn't just a bad stop. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a life derailed. A man's entire world turned upside down by the prejudice and unchecked power of one police officer. This was the real-world consequence of the culture he was hired to change. Before he could speak, Detective Rossi looked up from her tablet, her face pale. "Chief," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have the dashcam footage from the Jamal Peters arrest. But there's something else. I've been digging into the anonymous tip that led to your stop this morning." And Thorne prompted, leaning forward. "There was no anonymous tip," Rossi said, turning the tablet around for him to see. "The call didn't come from an outside line. I traced the signal. It's not on the public network." She pointed to a line of code on the screen, a digital fingerprint that told a story all its own. The call that reported a suspicious black male in a dark sedan. She took a deep breath. It originated from the GPS unit inside Officer Kowalski's patrol car. The silence in the conference room was heavier than a tombstone. Detective Rossi's words, it originated from the GPS unit inside Officer Kowalski's patrol car, hung in the air, poisoning the atmosphere. Sergeant Davison sank into a chair, his face ashen. He ran a hand over his mouth, his expression one of profound disillusionment. He had seen his share of dirty cops and departmental corruption, but this was different. This was a betrayal of the system at its most fundamental level. This wasn't just breaking the rules, it was rewriting them in secret. Marcus Thorne remained standing, his back to the room, looking out the large window at the town square below. People were milling about, sipping coffee, walking their dogs, living their lives in blissful ignorance of the cancer eating away at the institution sworn to protect them. He felt a cold, hard anger coalesce in his chest. Kowalski, the good partner, the one who had tried to de-escalate, who had seemed like a reluctant participant, dragged along by Miller's aggressive bigotry. It was all a lie. He wasn't a passive observer. He was the enabler, the architect of the entire confrontation. He had loaded the gun and handed it to Miller. "He played me." Thorne said, his voice dangerously soft. "He played all of us. He was the backup," Rossi said, her eyes glued to her tablet as she pulled up more data. "Miller was the muscle, but Kowalski provided the pretext. He manufactured the reasonable suspicion from inside his own vehicle, creating a digital ghost that would justify the stop. It's diabolically simple, and almost impossible to trace unless you know exactly what you're looking for." "They've done this before," Thorne stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm running a query now," Rossi replied. Cross-referencing Miller and Kowalski's patrol logs with every anonymous tip flagged for suspicious vehicles over the last 2 years. Oh my God. She looked up, her professional composure finally cracking. "Chief, There are dozens, at least 40 instances where an anonymous tip about a suspicious vehicle was logged within minutes of Miller and Kowalski initiating a traffic stop in the same area. In over 90% of those cases, the driver was a minority. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. This wasn't a one-time trick. It was a hunting tactic, a systematic, racially motivated program of harassment, all hidden behind a veil of falsified data. Thorne turned from the window, his face set like concrete. The time for reflection was over. It was time for action. "Sergeant Davison," he commanded, "go to Officer Kowalski's desk. Tell him I want to see him in this conference room immediately. Do not use your radio. Do not let him speak to anyone or use his phone. You will escort him here yourself." "Am I understood?" "Crystal clear," Chief Davison said, rising to his feet. A new grim determination had settled on his features. He was a man whose house had been infested, and he was now ready to help the exterminator burn it down. The 5 minutes they waited for Davison to return were the longest of Thorne's life. He paced the room, the anger inside him a churning furnace. He thought of Jamal Peters, his life ruined. He thought of the dozens of other unknown victims, men and women pulled over, humiliated and possibly arrested, all because 2 rogue cops had decided they didn't belong. When the door opened, Officer Kowalski walked in, a look of mild confusion on his face. He saw Thorne, then Rossi, and the piles of files on the table. The confusion curdled into apprehension. Chief Kowalski began. "Sergeant Davison said you wanted to see me." "That's right, officer. Have a seat," Thorne said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. It was the seat of a suspect in an interrogation room. Kowalski sat perching nervously on the edge of the cushion. "We're conducting a review of this morning's incident." Thorne began, his tone deceptively calm. "We're trying to build a complete and accurate timeline of events. Let's start with the tip, the one about a suspicious black male in a dark sedan." "Tell me about that again." Kowalski swallowed his eyes, darting towards Davison, who stood by the door like a sentinel. "Like I said, sir, it came over the radio, an anonymous call that dispatch relayed." "Is that so?" Thorne leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Detective Rossi, you're our expert on the digital systems here. Is that what your data shows?" Rossi didn't look at Kowalski. She looked directly at her tablet screen as she spoke. "No, Chief. That is not what the data shows. The data shows no incoming call from any anonymous civilian. The data shows the signal originated from the transceiver in patrol car 307. Your car, Officer Kowalski. You faked the call. You created the pretext for your partner to initiate the stop." The color drained from Kowalski's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a cornered animal looking for an escape that didn't exist. That's not possible," he stammered. "It must be a computer error. A glitch." "We've already ruled that out," Rossi said flatly, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was withering. "We've also found 42 other glitches just like it over the past 2 years, all corresponding to traffic stops you and Officer Miller conducted, all targeting minorities." Kowalski began to hyperventilate, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The trap had been sprung, and he was caught fast. "I want a lawyer," he gasped. "You'll get one," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "And you'll need a good one. Because we're not talking about a departmental violation anymore, Kowalski. We're talking about a criminal conspiracy. We're talking about falsifying evidence, official oppression, and federal hate crime charges. Miller is gone. His father-in-law can't protect him. No one can protect you. Your life as you know it is over. Thorne stood up and leaned over the table. His face just inches from Kowalski's. But I'm going to give you one chance, one opportunity to salvage a single shred of dignity from this wreckage. You can stonewall protect your racist partner and take the full weight of the U.S. Attorney's Office on your shoulders, or you can tell me everything, right now. Who else was involved? How deep does this go? Who taught you how to do it? Your cooperation is the only thing of value you have left. Tears streamed down Kowalski's face. He was broken. The weak link in the chain had shattered. It was Billy, he sobbed, his whole body trembling. It was always his idea. He said it was just proactive policing, a way to get around the brass and their stupid rules. He learned it from some of the older guys. Henderson knew. He called it shaking the trees to see what falls out. I went along with it. I didn't want him to think I was soft. The confession tumbled out a pathetic torrent of fear and weakness. He admitted to everything: the fake calls, the targeting of minorities, the case of Jamal Peters. He was a follower, a man so desperate for the approval of his peers that he had sacrificed his own morality. Thorne listened to the whole sordid story without interruption. When Kowalski was finished, a spent and weeping mess, Thorne simply turned to Davison. "Sergeant, take Officer Kowalski to an empty office. He is suspended pending termination. He is not to leave. He is now a material witness in a federal investigation. Get his official written statement." Davison nodded grimly and helped the trembling officer out of the room. Thorne was left alone with Rossi. The anger he had felt was now replaced by a vast, chilling clarity. Henderson knew Thorne said quietly more to himself than to Rossi. His sergeant, his father-in-law. This wasn't just a couple of rogue officers. This was taught. This was a culture. He looked out the window again. The peaceful town. The pristine department. It was all a facade. He hadn't been hired to trim a few weeds. He had been hired to tear down a house that was rotten to its very foundations and to build a new one in its place. And he knew with absolute certainty that the old guard buried in those foundations would fight him with everything they had. The stop on the side of the road that morning hadn't been the start of the war. It had just been the first shot. The confession of Officer Kowalski left a vacuum in the room, a void filled only by the low hum of the building's air conditioning. Detective Rossi began methodically organizing her digital files, her movements precise and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just been unleashed. They didn't even bother to cover their tracks. Rossi said more to herself than to Thorne. They got arrogant, complacent. They thought no one would ever look. Power. When it goes unchecked, breeds that kind of arrogance, Thorne replied, his eyes still fixed on the town square. His mind was already moving past the confession, past Miller and Kowalski. They were just symptoms. He was focused on the disease. Henderson, the retired sergeant, the father-in-law, the one who taught them how to shake the trees. His phone buzzed. It was a calendar reminder. Breakfast with Mayor Thompson. 8 a.m. The Gilded Spoon. It was 7:55 a.m. Detective Thorne said, turning his full attention to Rossi. "Your investigation just expanded. I want everything you can find on retired Sergeant Henderson. Bank records, property deeds, phone logs for the last year of his service. If he was protecting Miller. It wasn't just out of familial loyalty. Dirty cops protect dirty cops for a reason. Find it. He then added his voice, softening slightly. And find Jamal Peters. The young man from the complaint file. The one who lost his car. His job. Find him. I need to speak with him. Understood, Chief Rossi said, already typing new commands into her tablet. Thorne straightened his hoodie. There was no time to change. He would meet the mayor, as he was not as the polished, decorated chief from Atlanta, but as the man who was just illegally stopped by one of his own. It was a more powerful statement than any suit and tie could make. The Gilded Spoon was the kind of place where deals were made over artisanal coffee and avocado toast. It was bright, airy, and filled with the quiet murmur of Northwood's affluent power brokers. Mayor Thompson, a man in his late 50s with a politician's perfect hair and an expensive suit, was already seated at a corner booth. He smiled broadly as Thorne approached, but the smile faltered slightly as he took in Thorne's attire and grim expression. Chief Thorne, the mayor, boomed, standing to shake his hand. I was beginning to worry. I trust your first morning in our quiet town has been uneventful. I'd call it many things, Mayor Thorne said, sliding into the booth. Uneventful isn't one of them. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As a waitress poured him a coffee, Thorne laid out the morning's events in stark, unsparing detail. He told him about the stop Miller's aggression, the discovery of the falsified call, Kowalski's confession, and the systematic targeting of minorities. He concluded with the name Sergeant Henderson. As Thorne spoke, Mayor Thompson's face went through a series of transformations. The initial bonhomie was replaced by shock, then by a deep, furrowed concern that looked suspiciously like political calculation. My God, Thompson whispered when Thorne finished. This is a nightmare, a PR nightmare of the highest order. We hired you to handle reform quietly, Chief, to tune up the engine, not to blow it up on the launch pad. The engine was already blown. Mayor Thorne countered his voice hard. It was just running on fumes and corruption. 2 of your officers are off the street, and they're likely facing federal charges. A retired sergeant is implicated. This isn't a PR problem. It's a criminal conspiracy that has been festering inside your police department for years. The mayor leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Okay. So we handle this. We fire the officers. We release a statement decrying their actions. We make you the face of the new reformed department. We can control the narrative. Thorne stared at the man, a profound sense of disappointment settling in. This isn't about a narrative, Mayor. This is about justice. There are victims. People whose lives have been ruined. Like Jamal Peters. Before the mayor could respond, a shadow fell over their table. Thorne looked up to see a large, broad-shouldered man in a rumpled suit. He had a face like a bulldog, and the weary, cynical eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting ugly battles. Mayor, the man grunted by way of greeting. He then turned his gaze to Thorne. You must be the new chief, Vince Riley. I'm the PBA representative for this local. The Police Benevolent Association. The Union. The first counterattack. Mr. Riley Thorne said, his voice level. I was wondering when you'd show up. I came as soon as I heard you suspended 2 of my men without due process. Riley said, his voice a low growl. You can't just strip officers of their badge and gun based on a single complaint, Chief. There are rules. There's a contract. Your men weren't suspended because of a complaint. Thorne corrected him. They were suspended because one of them confessed on record to being part of a criminal conspiracy to falsify evidence and systematically violate the civil rights of the citizens of this town. That's not a contract violation, Mr. Riley. That's a felony. Riley was momentarily taken aback by the directness and severity of the charge. He glanced at the mayor, who suddenly looked very interested in the contents of his coffee cup. "That's a hell of an accusation," Riley said, recovering. "And until I see some proof, it's just that, an accusation. I'm here to inform you, Chief, that the union will be fighting this. We'll be filing a grievance for wrongful suspension, and we will provide Officers Miller and Kowalski with the best legal defense money can buy." "You do that," Thorne said, taking a calm sip of his coffee. "But let me inform you of something. This is no longer just a departmental matter. The evidence is being forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So while your lawyers are filing grievances, my detectives will be uncovering the full scope of this rot. And anyone active or retired who was a part of it, who knew about it, or who covered it up will be held accountable." He stared directly into Riley's eyes, a silent challenge. "I was hired to reform this department. Let me be perfectly clear. This is what reform looks like." Vince Riley held his gaze for a long moment, the two men locked in a silent battle of wills. The union boss had built his career on intimidating chiefs and protecting his own. But he saw something in Thorne's eyes. He wasn't used to a complete and total absence of fear. Riley finally gave a curt nod. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning and walking away. The mayor finally looked up, his face pale. "You've just made a powerful enemy, Chief." "Good," Thorne said, placing his cup back on its saucer with a decisive click. The lines needed to be drawn. Now we all know where we stand. He rose from the table. "Thank you for the coffee, Mayor. I have a department to run." He left the mayor sitting alone in the booth, a man caught between the rock of a scandal he couldn't contain and the hard place of a police chief he couldn't control. The war for Northwood's soul had officially begun. The story of Chief Thorne and Officer Miller isn't just a story. It's a reflection of a reality many face every single day. It's a powerful reminder that true authority isn't found in a badge or a gun, but in character integrity and the courage to stand for what's right, even when you're the one being tested. The tables turned that morning in Northwood, not just for one officer, but for an total system. Justice sometimes isn't about loud confrontations, but the quiet, undeniable arrival of consequences. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of accountability and the hope for change, please give this video a like and share it with your friends and family. It helps more than you know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.